Marcus Ellison had always been the quiet one in class, invisible to professors who saw only skin, never genius. But the day a so-called impossible equation froze the lecture hall, the professor didn't call on his brightest student. He singled out Marcus, daring him to fail in front of everyone. The room waited for his humiliation, until Marcus picked up the chalk, and something no one expected began to unfold. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The lecture hall at Preston University smelled faintly of chalk dust and polished wood. Morning light slanted through the tall windows, striking the rows of students hunched over their notebooks. Some scribbled furiously, others tapped on laptops, the hum of keys joining the low murmur of shifting bodies. At the front stood Professor Richard Halverson, a man whose reputation traveled farther than the physics theories he taught. He was known not just for brilliance, but for his unrelenting sharpness, the kind that left students either exhilarated or broken. Marcus Ellison sat 3 rows from the back, as he always did, 19 years old, thin-framed, his posture quiet but steady. He blended into the crowd, his notebook filled with neat lines of equations no one ever asked to see. The silence around him wasn't about respect, it was about invisibility. Students rarely spoke to him, professors rarely remembered his name. In a school where appearances often counted more than ability, Marcus had mastered the art of being overlooked. He knew why. The whispers weren't loud, but he caught them. "He's probably here on a scholarship," someone once muttered. Another added, "Physics? That's not really his thing, right?" The sting of such comments wasn't new to Marcus. They followed him from high school to university, the shadow of stereotypes so heavy they drowned out curiosity about who he actually was. Yet he never argued back. He let the silence carry him, quietly, steadily, to the work he loved, equations that spoke to him like a second language. That morning, however, something shifted. The professor had just scrawled an equation across the blackboard, a monstrous tangle of integrals, derivatives, and symbols that stretched nearly the width of the wall. Halverson stood back, dusting his hands, his chalk-smudged blazer making him appear like a craftsman admiring his sculpture. "This," he announced, his voice clipped and commanding, "is a problem even graduate students struggle to touch. I don't expect any of you to solve it. Not today, not even this semester. But I want you to see it. I want you to understand what makes real physics intimidating." The words carried weight. Students leaned forward, some squinting, some shaking their heads. The air buzzed with both awe and defeat, as if the professor had placed a mountain in front of them and dared them to climb. Most of them had already accepted they wouldn't. But Marcus, sitting quietly in his seat, felt his pulse quicken. The equation wasn't intimidating. It was beautiful. The symmetry of its structure called to him. He could already see threads unraveling in his mind, pathways weaving through the symbols like rivers carving through stone. It wasn't arrogance. It was recognition, the kind of instinct a musician feels when hearing the first notes of a melody they already know how to complete. Still, Marcus didn't move. His hand remained on the notebook, his pencil tapping lightly against the page. He knew better than to draw attention. In spaces like these, his silence was his shield. Professor Halverson turned, scanning the room with eyes that lingered too long on certain faces. The students in the front rows, polished and confident, their hands always raised, their words always rehearsed. Then his gaze shifted further back, pausing briefly on Marcus. It wasn't admiration that crossed his face, but something harder to name, suspicion, almost irritation, as if Marcus's presence itself required justification. The professor's lip curled slightly before he spoke again. "Of course," he said. "Sometimes problems aren't just about intellect, they're about nerve, about who dares to stand before the rest and attempt what seems impossible." A few students chuckled, shaking their heads. "Not me," someone whispered. Another muttered, "Forget that." The tension in the room felt both alive and suffocating. Marcus kept his head down, but he felt the professor's eyes on him. The weight of that stare was heavier than the chalk dust settling on the desks. For a flicker of a moment, Marcus thought the professor might look past him, pick one of the confident front row students. That was the pattern. Challenge those already standing tall. Leave the quiet ones in the shadow. But then the professor spoke. "You," Halverson said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Heads turned. The room shifted in unison, eyes swinging to find the target. Marcus felt the heat rise in his face as dozens of gazes locked on him. His chest tightened, his hand frozen above the notebook. Yes, you, the professor repeated, pointing with the chalk. Ellison, isn't it? Stand up. Come solve this problem. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath. Marcus's chair scraped against the floor. As he stood, the sound sharp in the heavy quiet. He wanted to ask why, wanted to question the sudden choice, but the words caught in his throat. He had seen this happen before, not here but in classrooms all his life. Teachers calling on him not to highlight his ability, but to expose the possibility of failure. Whispers rippled through the rows. He's not gonna get it. Why him? This'll be quick. Marcus walked toward the front, each step slow, deliberate, as if the ground itself threatened to shift beneath him. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to meet the stares. At the board he stood beside the sprawling equation. The chalk offered like a weapon rather than a tool. Professor Halverson smiled faintly, but it wasn't kindness. It was a test, and not of physics. It was a test of worth, of belonging. Show us, the professor said, voice laced with challenge. Or show us why you can't. The words struck deeper than they seemed. They weren't about the equation. They were about Marcus himself, about every stereotype that lingered unspoken in rooms like these. Marcus reached for the chalk. His hand trembled, not from uncertainty of the math, but from the weight of the moment, pressing down on him. He could feel the entire room waiting, eager for his mistake, ready to laugh, or smirk, or dismiss him further. His mind, however, had already begun to move. Symbols and solutions danced in his thoughts, patterns unfolding like maps across a hidden landscape. He knew the path. He could see it clearer than the doubt etched on the professor's face. Still, doubt gnawed at him. Should he show what he knew? Or should he step back, let the stereotype live undisturbed? Avoid the backlash brilliance often invited. The chalk pressed against the board, the faint scratch echoing through the room. Marcus drew the first symbol. And then, suddenly, he stopped. The whispers grew louder, curiosity laced with disbelief. Students leaned forward, waiting to see collapse, waiting for the inevitable stumble. But Marcus's hesitation wasn't about failure. It was about choice. He stood between silence and revelation, between invisibility and exposure, knowing whichever path he chose would change everything. At the back of the room, a clock ticked louder in his ears. Professor Halverson leaned against the desk, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Well, he said, the challenge thick in his voice. Marcus turned, slowly, chalk still in hand. His gaze met the professor's, steady, unblinking, carrying a fire no one had seen before. And then, without breaking eye contact, Marcus lifted the chalk again. The room held its breath. The professor pointed directly at Marcus and demanded he solve it before everyone. Marcus stood at the board, chalk trembling slightly between his fingers. The sound of the professor's voice still hung in the air, challenging him, reducing his presence to a spectacle. The board seemed endless now, the white markings stretching like a battlefield he hadn't chosen but was forced to fight upon. Every breath he took felt like an echo of past moments, years of being underestimated, doubted, dismissed before he even had the chance to begin. He remembered middle school, the sting of being overlooked during a science fair. His project on magnetic fields had been precise, innovative, and tested 3 times over. Yet when the judges passed his booth, they barely glanced. One whispered to another, "Surprising, isn't it?" They moved on quickly, as though his work could not possibly belong to him. The prize went to a boy whose project Marcus had quietly helped fix the night before. That memory burned now, searing through his chest as he stood before another audience eager to see him stumble. The chalk pressed harder into his palm, sweat gathering at the base of his hand. Around him the rustle of notebooks ceased, replaced by a thick silence. Students leaned in, hungry for what came next. Their eyes weren't encouraging, weren't patient. They were waiting. The kind of waiting that had no kindness, only curiosity wrapped in doubt. "Any time now, Ellison," Professor Halverson said coolly, leaning back against the desk with arms crossed. His words dripped with performance, not instruction. He wasn't guiding Marcus. He was daring him. Marcus drew a slow breath, trying to steady himself. The equation in front of him wasn't frightening. He'd worked through harder ones late at night when campus slept. What weighed him down wasn't the math but the centuries of disbelief pressing onto his shoulders. Voices of strangers he had never met, but knew all too well. Voices that said not you, not here, not ever. From the back of the room, a whisper broke the silence. "He's stalling. It wasn't shouted, but the ripple it caused moved through the rows. A soft laugh followed, sharp and cutting in the quiet. Another voice, a girl near the front, muttered, "This'll be quick." Marcus tightened his grip on the chalk, the ridges digging into his fingers. He wanted to block them out to let the equation speak for him, but memory kept intruding, memories of teachers doubting his test scores, of classmates accusing him of cheating when he scored higher than expected, of the counselor who once suggested maybe engineering or physics wasn't the right fit. He shifted his weight, his shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. The professor's eyes didn't waver. They were fixed on him with the precision of someone certain of an outcome, someone eager to watch inevitability unfold. Marcus finally pressed the chalk to the board. A faint squeak rang out as he traced the first line. Steady but slow. The air grew heavier. He wasn't just solving, he was fighting every dismissal that had trailed him here. His hand moved, his mind racing, pulling threads together. For a moment, he forgot the room and remembered only the beauty of the math. But then, "Careful there," the professor interrupted sharply, as though correcting a child. The words sliced across the room, drawing chuckles from a few students. Marcus froze mid-symbol. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew better. Words from him would only be twisted into defiance, arrogance, or disrespect. Instead, he breathed, and continued. One line after another, the board began to fill with his markings. His strokes weren't random. They had rhythm, intention. A few students in the front leaned closer, frowning. They expected scribbles of confusion, not a sequence that actually made sense. A boy whispered, "Wait, that's right," but his voice faded as the professor cleared his throat loudly, reclaiming control of the room. Marcus felt the burn of dozens of eyes drilling into his back. Some were skeptical, others curious, a few narrowing with disbelief. The more progress he made, the more the silence thickened, no longer just waiting for failure, but confused by the possibility of something else. Still, beneath it all, Marcus carried the scars of past moments too deeply to ignore. He heard the snicker of a classmate from 10th grade, mocking his pronunciation of a physics term, only to repeat it minutes later and be praised by the teacher. He remembered the sting of being told he was surprisingly articulate after a presentation. Those memories weren't gone. They lived under his skin, rising now as he stood under this spotlight not meant for him. Halverson shifted his stance, his smirk tightening. He hadn't expected Marcus to last this long. Hadn't expected the lines on the board to look like more than guesses. His jaw flexed slightly, but he said nothing. For now, Marcus, however, felt his heartbeat climb higher. Not from confusion but from the crushing pressure of expectation. He wanted to prove them wrong, to carve his place here. Yet he also feared what came after. Genius, when worn by someone like him, rarely led to applause. It led to suspicion, to resentment, to isolation. The chalk slipped slightly in his sweaty grip. He caught it, steadying himself, but the faint motion drew a chuckle from the back. "Nervous?" someone whispered, just loud enough to be heard. Laughter followed, muffled but real. Marcus clenched his jaw, refusing to turn. His hand moved again, drawing the next step. His breathing grew slower, more focused. Each symbol carried both the weight of dismissal and the spark of defiance. His silence was no longer just invisibility. It was strategy. If he could let the math speak, maybe, just maybe, it would silence the room. But as the chalk squeaked across the board, a sharp crack echoed through the hall. Marcus looked down. The chalk had snapped in his hand, a jagged piece falling to the floor. Gasps and laughter erupted, louder this time. "Figures," a voice called out, mocking. Couldn't even hold it together. His chest tightened, the humiliation striking fast. He bent down, scooping the broken piece, his hand trembling more now. He could feel the professor's smirk deepen, feeding off the moment. "Compose yourself, Ellison," Halverson said, his tone dripping with false patience. "The class is waiting." Marcus swallowed hard. His throat ached with words he wouldn't speak. His eyes burned, but he steadied the chalk again. He couldn't stop now. He wouldn't. And yet, as he pressed the chalk back to the board, the whispers shifted. They weren't just mocking anymore. They were questioning. "Wait. He's actually getting it," one student muttered. Another whispered, "That's the right approach." The room's energy flickered, a strange blend of ridicule and reluctant realization. Marcus didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge them. He focused, breathing in, marking the next step. Each line carried defiance, each symbol a refusal to be erased. But as he worked, his body trembled under the weight of every memory, every dismissal that had ever told him he wasn't meant to stand here. The board in front of him wasn't just math, it was a battlefield of history, stereotypes, and scars. He tightened his grip again. His pulse roared. The silence pressed down heavier than any noise. And as he approached the most critical step, he felt the full force of the room behind him, waiting, willing him to collapse under their gaze. As Marcus approached the board, he felt the entire room waiting for him to fail. The air in the lecture hall grew heavier with each stroke of chalk. Marcus laid across the blackboard. The lines were precise, his movements deliberate, yet the professor's smirk never faded. It wasn't the kind of expression a teacher gave to a student daring to rise to a challenge. It was the smirk of a man who already knew the ending he wanted. To Professor Halverson, this wasn't an exercise in learning. It was a trap. He had thrown Marcus into the spotlight, not to illuminate his ability, but to prove what he believed all along, that Marcus did not belong in this room. The professor shifted his weight, folding his arms tightly across his chest, chalk dust still clinging to his sleeve. His eyes glistened with a strange satisfaction, as if Marcus's every movement was part of a play unfolding exactly as scripted. He wasn't watching for genius. He was watching for collapse. That was the silent racism at work here. Subtle but sharp. It wasn't loud slurs or blatant exclusion. It was the quiet certainty that Marcus could not possibly succeed, and the eagerness to see him fail just to confirm it. The students around the room absorbed that energy. They leaned in with a collective expectation, their stares heavy on Marcus's back. Some smiled faintly, amused at what they assumed would be a slow unraveling. Others looked bored, as though the outcome was already obvious. None of them saw his presence at the board as an opportunity for brilliance. They saw it as entertainment, a performance designed to end in embarrassment. "Come now," Professor Halverson said, his tone deceptively light. "Surely you have something to offer, or is this above your level?" A ripple of chuckles spread across the room. Marcus stiffened, but didn't turn. He knew better than to answer. Every word he spoke could be twisted. His silence wasn't weakness, it was protection. But even silence could be dangerous when interpreted through bias. He pressed the chalk harder to the board, tracing the next steps. His handwriting was crisp, his symbols elegant, but his mind wasn't just occupied with the math. It was haunted by the years of being underestimated. He thought of the ninth-grade teacher who told him, "It's okay if this subject isn't for you. Physics is challenging for everyone." She'd said it with a smile, but behind it was the assumption that someone like him couldn't possibly thrive here. Marcus's throat tightened at the memory. The weight of all those small dismissals pressed down on him now, heavy as lead. Every smirk, every skeptical glance, every moment of being overlooked gathered in this room, embodied in the professor's eyes. He continued, line by line, the equation unfolding like a puzzle. Whispers spread in the room again, some mocking, some surprised. A boy near the front leaned toward his classmate and muttered, "Wait, that actually makes sense." His friend shrugged, "Probably just a fluke. Let's see how long it lasts." The professor's smirk deepened, though his jaw tightened faintly. He stepped forward, breaking the silence. "Interesting approach," Halverson said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But tell us, Marcus, why this method? Did you read about it somewhere?" The implication was sharp. Marcus couldn't possibly be producing original reasoning. He had to be imitating, borrowing, or guessing. Marcus hesitated. He wanted to answer, to explain the logic unfolding in his mind. But he knew that answering wouldn't earn respect. It would invite more doubt, more subtle digs. His silence was interpreted as weakness, but his words would be framed as arrogance. "Cat got your tongue?" the professor asked, his voice rising slightly. The students chuckled again, laughter bouncing off the lecture hall's high walls. Marcus clenched the chalk until it nearly broke again. He lowered his gaze, focusing only on the board. If he gave them brilliance, maybe it would be undeniable. Maybe the math itself would silence their prejudice. But prejudice had a way of bending even truth. The professor turned to the class, lifting a brow. "Observe, everyone. This is why one must be cautious about confidence. Too often students think they can handle what they cannot. They walk into advanced subjects unprepared. And, well, this is the result." It wasn't just a comment about Marcus. It was a performance meant for the room. Marcus wasn't being tested. He was being used as an example. His failure, real or imagined, was supposed to reinforce the professor's authority and the unspoken narrative that some people simply didn't belong. Marcus's chest burned, anger swirling beneath the quiet calm he showed on the surface. His hands trembled slightly as he moved to the next step. The chalk squeaked loudly, the sound jarring against the silence. He caught himself mid-symbol, heart pounding. The board stretched before him, half filled with his work. He knew the path forward, but the pressure bore down on him like a weight. Every eye, every smirk, every doubt pressed against him. The professor leaned forward now, eager, waiting for the collapse he'd orchestrated. And then an unexpected voice cut through the silence. Let him finish. It came from the back row, a girl with curly hair and glasses, her voice steady but quiet. The room shifted slightly, students turning to glance at her. It wasn't loud, it wasn't defiant, but it broke the rhythm. Someone at least wasn't waiting for Marcus to fall. Halverson's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. He simply crossed his arms tighter, his smirk straining at the edges. Marcus's pulse steadied, just a little. He pressed the chalk back to the board, drawing the next line. His movements grew slower, more cautious, but precise. The professor exhaled sharply, then walked closer, his footsteps echoing against the tile floor. He stopped just behind Marcus, his presence looming. Careful now, he said, voice low enough for only Marcus to hear. One mistake, and this whole performance unravels. Don't embarrass yourself further. The words stung, not because Marcus doubted his ability, but because the professor had stripped the moment of its integrity. This wasn't about knowledge anymore. It was about humiliation. Marcus's hand froze, chalk hovering just above the board. His mind was still racing with solutions, but his body felt paralyzed under the weight of expectation. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears, drowning out the murmurs around him. The room leaned in, silence deepening. Every student watched, breaths held, waiting for the collapse that seemed inevitable. Marcus inhaled, his chest rising, his mind battling the pressure. He had the answer. He knew he had it, but his body wouldn't move. And with every eye locked on him, Marcus lifted the chalk, but froze mid-thought. The chalk hovered in Marcus's hand like a blade suspended in air, the entire room holding its breath. He could feel sweat cooling on his forehead, his pulse still pounding from the professor's whispered venom. For a moment, he almost let the weight of those words win. Almost. But then, somewhere deep inside, a spark flickered, small, fragile, but steady. It wasn't born of anger. It wasn't born of defiance. It was born of knowing. Marcus knew the equation before him wasn't a wall. It was a doorway. He only had to choose to walk through. His fingers tightened around the chalk. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, letting the noise of the room fade. He couldn't carry the stares, the smirks or the low expectations anymore. He could only carry the math. And so, with a movement almost gentle, Marcus lowered his hand and drew the first line. The chalk sang against the board, a crisp sound that cut through the silence. A clean derivative symbol, precise, confident, elegant. The whispers erupted instantly. They weren't loud, but they rippled through the rows, laced with disbelief. Wait, one voice murmured. Another leaned forward, squinting. That's not random. He's actually doing it. The students who had been leaning back in their chairs, bored and expectant of failure, now sat straighter, the hum of curiosity creeping into their skepticism. Marcus's hand moved again, building from the first line into a structure that unfolded like music. The rhythm of it was undeniable, each stroke flowing into the next, every symbol placed with deliberate ease. He wasn't just solving, he was composing. To him, physics was never dry, numbers on a board. It was melody, harmony, patterns of the universe written in symbols. And now, in this silent hall, he let it flow. A girl in the front row frowned, tilting her head. That's the exact reduction we learned in advanced quantum, she whispered. Her classmate glanced at her, confused. But this isn't even a quantum class. She shook her head. That's my point. At the back of the room, someone muttered, no way. The disbelief was almost louder than the whispers of admiration. Marcus wasn't supposed to be here. Wasn't supposed to know this. Wasn't supposed to be capable. And yet the board was filling with proof that he was. Professor Halverson's smirk wavered. Just slightly. His arms remained crossed, but his eyes narrowed, following the symbols with growing unease. This wasn't improvisation. It wasn't blind guessing. It was precision. It was control. It was brilliance. and it was undeniable. Marcus didn't notice the shifting energy yet. His world had collapsed into the chalk and the board. Each step unfolded naturally in his mind, one leading seamlessly to the next. He no longer trembled. His hand was steady now, each mark echoing the confidence he had buried for so long. He thought of late nights in his dorm, working through problems while the world slept, the satisfaction of seeing complexity unravel beneath his pencil. He thought of the times he wanted to share, to raise his hand in class, but swallowed the impulse because he knew what would follow. Skepticism, dismissal, the subtle sting of disbelief. He thought of how silence had been his shield, but now silence was breaking. The classroom, once filled with doubt, now leaned forward in a strange kind of tension. Whispers grew sharper, some filled with awe, others with resistance.
How does he even know that? Did he memorize this?
No, look, he's building it step by step. Halverson finally broke the silence with a clipped tone. Interesting start, but let's not mistake a good beginning for comprehension. It was meant to cut Marcus down, to reframe his progress as superficial, but even as the words left the professor's mouth, Marcus's hand moved again, laying down the next step with such clarity that it silenced half the whispers instantly. The solution wasn't just correct, it was elegant. Students recognized patterns they themselves hadn't considered. Some exchanged looks, wide-eyed, their skepticism softening into reluctant admiration. And then it happened. The unexpected twist. A boy in the middle row pulled out his phone, angling it discreetly. His lens caught Marcus's hand moving across the board, the symbols forming in real time. Another student noticed, then another. Soon, 2-3 phones were out, recording quietly. What had started as a moment of expected humiliation was transforming into something none of them wanted to forget. Marcus still didn't see them. He was too deep in the math. But the room did, and the air shifted once more. This wasn't just about a lecture hall anymore. This was about evidence, about a moment too rare, too sharp to vanish. The professor noticed, though. His eyes darted briefly to the phones, his jaw tightening. He didn't say anything, but the unease in his expression grew. He had staged this moment to confirm a bias, to prove his authority by watching Marcus crumble. But now the script was breaking, and the audience wasn't laughing. They were watching closely, hungrily, as Marcus filled the board with brilliance that could not be ignored. Marcus paused for a breath, the chalk white against his dark fingers. He stepped back just enough to review what he had written. It was right. He knew it was right. He felt the elegance of it in his chest, a harmony resonating deep inside. But he also felt something else. The room, the whispers, the silence between them, the disbelief twisting into something new. He didn't know yet what they would call it. Admiration, suspicion, or something darker, but he knew the moment was fragile. Too fragile. Halverson finally stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the tile. He moved closer, eyes sharp, scanning the board as though searching for flaws. His smirk was gone now, replaced by a tightening around his mouth. Curious, he muttered, loud enough for the class to hear. Very curious indeed. But let's see how long this holds. Marcus didn't respond. He turned back to the board, lifting the chalk again. The next part would seal it. The line that tied the structure together. The proof that this wasn't chance, wasn't imitation, but understanding. He pressed the chalk to the board once more. The whispers ceased. Even the faint rustle of notebooks stilled. Students leaned forward, eyes wide, breaths caught. And as the line curved across the board, clean and precise, the professor leaned forward, suddenly uneasy. The classroom was no longer breathing. The sound of chalk on the board had silenced every cough, every shuffle, every whisper of paper. Marcus's hand moved with steady rhythm, symbols blooming into structure, each step building upon the last with quiet authority. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't floundering, he was teaching. Each line of his work wasn't simply about solving the professor's impossible problem. It was about explaining it without words. The elegance of his method carried instruction. The clarity of his reasoning filled gaps that textbooks left blank. His movements had the calm precision of someone who didn't just know the path, but had walked it countless times before. And in that moment, the lecture hall wasn't just a classroom. It was Marcus's stage, one he had never been invited to step on, but one he now cannoned. Students who had smirked minutes earlier leaned forward with narrowed eyes, curiosity cutting through their prejudice. Some began copying his steps into their notebooks almost reflexively, the way they would if the professor himself were lecturing. They didn't even realize they were doing it. Marcus's silence was no longer invisibility. It was authority, unspoken but undeniable. But authority in the wrong hands, in the wrong body, was dangerous. Halverson's arms, once crossed in smug certainty, slowly dropped to his sides. His smirk had slipped entirely, replaced by a tightness around his jaw. He moved closer to the board, scanning each mark, as though searching for cracks in the structure. But there were none. The solution Marcus was weaving was airtight, its logic undeniable. The more flawless it became, the more uneasy Halverson grew. This wasn't what he had intended. He hadn't brought Marcus to the board to succeed. He had chosen him precisely because he assumed failure was inevitable. That was the point to prove, subtly but publicly, that some students simply didn't belong at the forefront of brilliance. And yet, with every precise stroke of chalk, Marcus dismantled that unspoken narrative. Whispers shifted again. This time, they weren't mocking. Wait, he's actually right. That's the exact step from the advanced lecture last year. I thought this was supposed to be impossible. Phones were still out, recording silently from the middle rows, small red lights blinking faintly in the corners of the room. The students who held them weren't mocking now. They were documenting. Something rare was happening, and they wanted proof. Marcus stepped back for a moment, surveying the half-finished solution. His chest rose and fell steadily, his earlier trembling gone. He wasn't thinking about the professor anymore, nor the stairs, nor the history pressing on his shoulders. He was inside the math now, immersed in its rhythm. The problem wasn't a trap anymore, it was an invitation, and he had accepted it. Halverson, however, couldn't let it stand. He cleared his throat sharply, stepping closer. Interesting, he said, his tone loud enough to cut through the quiet. But let's remember, elegance doesn't always equal accuracy. It was a lifeline thrown to the room, a reminder that Marcus might still collapse. The professor wasn't addressing Marcus. He was addressing the students, reminding them where authority still lay. Marcus ignored the jab. He turned back, chalk pressed to the board again, his movements deliberate. The next series of steps unfolded with such clarity that even those unfamiliar with the deeper math began to recognize the structure. The solution wasn't just forming, it was teaching them how to see it. One girl whispered to her friend, "He's explaining it without saying a word." Her friend nodded slowly, eyes wide. Halverson's unease deepened. Authority was slipping from his hands. The power of the lecture hall, the spotlight of knowledge, was no longer his. It was Marcus's. And that was something he couldn't allow. He stepped closer still, until he stood almost behind Marcus, his presence looming. "Careful now," he said, his voice calm but edged. "One misstep, and this illusion crumbles." Marcus froze briefly, chalk still pressed to the board. He felt the professor's breath at his back, the reminder that no matter what brilliance he displayed, authority could still try to erase it. But he moved again, defiance quiet, but powerful. Another step, another line. The structure now neared its conclusion, the logic tightening, undeniable. A gasp broke from the back of the room. One student, phone still recording, whispered, "He's about to finish it." Another muttered, "No way." The air thickened with anticipation. The moment of completion was near, the point where Marcus's solution would be whole, impossible to dismiss. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of the room not as dismissal, but as focus. Every eye was on him, but this time, the expectation was shifting, not just of failure, but of brilliance revealed. And that shift terrified the professor more than failure ever could. Because if Marcus succeeded, the unspoken balance of power in that room between authority and student, between stereotype and truth, would Halverson's face tightened further, his unease turning sharp. He glanced quickly at the phones recording from the middle rows. This wasn't just a classroom moment anymore. It was evidence. Evidence that Marcus belonged. Evidence that Halverson's bias had been exposed. Evidence that genius could come from the very person he had tried to diminish. And so, as Marcus lifted the chalk for the final step, Halverson stepped forward abruptly. "That's enough," he said, his voice sudden and sharp. The words cracked through the silence like thunder. Students jolted in their seats, some gasping, others frowning in confusion. Marcus froze, chalk still in hand, inches away from completing the solution. His body stiffened, his pulse pounding. He turned slightly, his eyes meeting the professor's. Halverson forced a thin smile, though his voice was firm. "We've seen enough for today. Let's not waste any more time. The class erupted in whispers, louder now, questioning, confused. Why is he stopping him? But he was almost done. That was right. Why cut him off? The phones kept recording, every second of it. Marcus's chest ached with a mix of fury and disbelief. He hadn't been stopped because he was wrong. He'd been stopped because he was right. His brilliance wasn't a mistake. It was a threat. The board behind him, half filled with elegance, stood as proof. Proof the professor wanted erased. Proof the professor couldn't allow to be completed. Marcus tightened his grip on the chalk, his knuckles white. For the first time he turned fully toward Halverson, meeting his eyes head-on. His gaze wasn't timid now. It was steady, defiant, burning with the weight of everything this moment meant. The room held its breath again, caught between authority and truth, between silence and revelation. But just as the solution neared completion, the professor cut him off. The professor's voice cracked through the charged silence of the hall, sharp as a blade. That's enough. Students shifted in their seats, whispering. The chalk in Marcus's hand hovered inches from the board, the last line of the solution hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. His chest heaved slowly, his mind still wrapped around the beauty of the math, but his body frozen by the sudden interruption. Halverson stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tile with deliberate weight. He came close, squinting at the board, as though the half-finished solution were a crime scene. Interesting, he said, his voice cool, clipped, laced with a patronizing edge. But what we have here, class, is a classic example of misapplied confidence. The words rippled across the room, immediately bending the atmosphere. The awe that had been building in some students' eyes wavered. The professor's authority was heavy, his tone commanding, designed not just to critique, but to control the narrative. Marcus clenched the chalk tighter. He wanted to speak, to defend, but he knew the trap too well. Words in his mouth would be twisted. He stayed silent, though his silence burned. Halverson gestured to a symbol on the board, tapping it with a piece of chalk from his pocket. Here, for instance, this reduction. Why attempt it this way? It looks neat, yes, but neatness is not rigor. Can anyone else see the flaw? A murmur moved through the class. Students craned their necks, squinting. Most didn't understand enough to judge, but they trusted the professor's tone. His dismissal shaped their perception more than the symbols themselves. That was his power. His words carried more weight than Marcus's proof. Marcus stared at the spot Halverson pointed to. There was no flaw. The reduction was sound. He knew it. But in the room's silence, under the professor's voice, his certainty trembled like glass about to shatter. Ellison, Halverson said, turning to him with a sharp smile. Explain it. The challenge wasn't about clarity. It was about cornering him. Marcus swallowed, his throat dry. His voice came out softer than he wanted, but steady. That step simplifies the boundary condition. It's the standard approach. Standard? Halverson cut him off, raising his brow. Are you quoting something? Did you memorize this from somewhere? Because it feels rehearsed. The laughter was small, scattered, but sharp enough to cut. Marcus's stomach knotted. He forced his voice stronger. No, it's not memorized. It's logical progression from the… Progression? Halverson interrupted again, pacing slightly in front of the board. You see, class, this is what happens when students rely too heavily on pattern recognition. They mimic what they've seen but lack the underlying comprehension. Isn't that right, Ellison? Marcus' chest tightened. No, he said quickly, his voice firmer now. I understand what I'm doing. Halverson smiled faintly, tilting his head. Do you? Then prove it. Erase this line, and redo it. This time, explain each symbol, as you go, out loud, slowly. The demand struck like a hammer. Marcus's grip on the chalk faltered. He glanced at the board, then at the sea of faces turned toward him. His solution, so elegant, so precise, was being unraveled, not by math but by authority. He hesitated. That's what I thought, Halverson said smoothly, turning to the class. Confidence without comprehension. The words landed heavy, pulling murmurs from the rows. Some nodded, already swayed. Others looked uncertain, caught between what they'd witnessed and what they were being told. Marcus's hands shook. He could feel the chalk slipping, feel the weight of every dismissal in his life pressing on him. This wasn't about physics anymore. This was survival under scrutiny, against the system, against expectation, against the professor who wielded power like a weapon. His mind screamed to finish the equation, to show them, but Halverson pressed on. "Tell me, Ellison," the professor said, his tone deceptively casual. "How long did you spend studying this problem in advance? Did you find it online? Did someone help you?" The insinuation spread like wildfire. Whispers sparked instantly. He cheated? Did he steal the solution? Maybe that's how. Marcus' throat burned. He shook his head, his voice cracking but strong. "No, I didn't. I've never seen this problem before." Halverson arched a brow. "Never? And yet, here you are, breezing through what takes graduate students hours. Curious, isn't it?" The students murmured louder now, doubt lacing the room. Phones were still recording, capturing every word, every shift of tone, but Marcus didn't know. All he felt was the humiliation, sharp and suffocating. His silence stretched too long. Halverson seized it. "Erase it," he commanded. Marcus blinked. "What?" "Erase it," the professor repeated, his voice louder. "Start over. If you truly understand, it shouldn't be a problem. Unless, of course, you don't." Gasps echoed faintly. The demand wasn't fair, wasn't pedagogical. It was public breaking, a performance of authority. Marcus stared at the board. His solution, almost complete, gleamed back at him, the fruit of his brilliance and his courage. To erase it would be to erase himself. His chest heaved, his fingers trembled. And then, slowly, Marcus lowered the chalk. He turned not to the professor, but to the class. His eyes swept across the rows of students, steady now, burning with something harder than fear. For the first time that morning, Marcus wasn't silent because of invisibility. He was silent because of defiance. The room stilled. Halverson frowned, his smile fading. "Ellison," he said, his tone clipped. "Erase it. That's an order." Marcus didn't move. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment hang heavy. His shoulders squared, his jaw set. He refused. And then, with deliberate calm, Marcus placed the chalk on the ledge beneath the board. He faced the room, eyes locked on his classmates. Marcus refused to erase his work, and turned to face the class. The silence after Marcus turned to face the class was heavier than any sound could have been. His refusal to erase the board lingered like a challenge in the air, a line drawn without words. The chalk lay untouched on the ledge beneath the blackboard, its dust smudged on his fingertips, but Marcus no longer needed it. The board spoke for him. The work remained, clear and sharp, standing as evidence no command could erase. Students shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others whispering in low tones. At first they had expected a spectacle, an inevitable collapse dressed up as courage. That was why they had smirked when the professor singled Marcus out, why they chuckled when the chalk snapped in his hands. But the collapse never came. Instead, the room had watched line after line unfold into elegance. And now, faced with the professor's attempt to humiliate him, Marcus's quiet defiance was beginning to look less like stubbornness and more like strength. A boy in the third row, Ryan Mallory, frowned as he glanced at his notes. He had copied Marcus's steps without realizing it, following along because the logic was too clean to ignore. Now he compared them side by side, his pencil tapping nervously against the page. The more he looked, the more he saw that Marcus's method wasn't just valid, it was better than the one Halverson had shown in class, the week before. Ryan leaned toward the girl next to him. "Hey," he whispered. This is actually right. Look." She glanced, skepticism tightening her features. But as her eyes scanned the notes, her brows lifted. "Wait." He simplified it faster than the professor did. Their voices weren't loud, but whispers had a way of traveling in silence. Other students glanced over, curiosity tugging at their doubt. Halverson noticed. His jaw tightened, though his smile remained fixed, brittle around the edges. "Enough games," he said, voice cutting the air. "Ellison, you've wasted enough of our time." But the words didn't land with the same force they once did. Authority cracked when it collided with evidence, and the board behind Marcus was undeniable. Marcus didn't move. His gaze swept across the lecture hall, meeting eyes where he could. He saw skepticism, yes, but also something new: interest, confusion, admiration, even. He hadn't expected it, he hadn't wanted it, but it was there, flickering like sparks in a room that once smothered him. A girl in the back row, Emily Cortez, raised her hand hesitantly. Halverson turned, startled by the break in silence. "Yes?" he asked, his tone sharp. Um, I don't think he's wrong, Emily said carefully. Her voice trembled, but her words carried. The reduction step. He didn't misapply it. That's the same one in our advanced mechanics text. Murmurs rippled instantly. Some students nodded faintly. Others frowned. But the shift was real. Doubt was no longer pointed at Marcus. It was tilting toward the professor. Halverson's face darkened. He walked to the board, tapping Marcus's line again, with his chalk. You think this is correct? Then explain to the class why it works, Miss Cortez. Emily froze, shrinking back in her seat. I can't explain it, but I know I've seen it before. Halverson smirked faintly, regaining control. Exactly. Recognition without comprehension. Just like our friend here. He nodded toward Marcus. The attempt at dismissal worked on some students shifted uncomfortably, unsure whom to trust. But others weren't convinced. Ryan spoke louder now. No, but she's right. Look at the symmetry. It's clean. That's not copying. That's understanding. The professor's eyes snapped to him. Mr. Mallory, are you suggesting you understand this better than I do? Ryan paled instantly, shrinking into his chair. No, sir. Then perhaps keep your observations to yourself, Halverson said, his tone slicing. The room stilled again. Marcus's chest tightened. He could feel the old pattern trying to reassert itself. Authority silencing doubt, forcing students back into compliance. But this time something lingered. The spark Emily and Ryan had lit wasn't gone. It buzzed in the air, fragile but alive. And then came the twist. From the middle row, a faint glow flickered. A phone, angled discreetly. Its screen caught Marcus against the board, his work filling the background. The student holding it, a tall boy named Jordan Hayes, kept his head low, pretending to look at his notebook, but the lens stayed fixed, recording every second. Another phone appeared, then another. Not openly, not boldly, quietly, secretly, but deliberately. They had been recording since Marcus's first elegant line, but now the cameras felt heavier. This wasn't just about proof of his math anymore. This was about proof of what was being done to him. Halverson didn't notice at first. He was too focused on Marcus, circling him like a hawk. Erase it, Ellison, he said again, his voice low, his smile sharp. You're wasting everyone's time. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't move. His silence wasn't weakness now. It was a mirror, reflecting the professor's cruelty back at the room. The whispers grew again. Not mocking this time, but questioning. Why won't he let him finish? It looks right. Why erase it? Halverson's eyes darted to the students, then back to Marcus. For a flicker of a moment, unease crossed his face again. He saw the board, saw the quiet admiration stirring in the rows, and he knew the tide was shifting. Marcus held the silence longer. His chest rose and fell steadily, his eyes sweeping the lecture hall once more. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't small. For the first time they were seeing him, not as a stereotype. Not as a shadow, but as someone they couldn't ignore. Halverson's jaw clenched. He turned sharply, facing the class. Physics isn't about showmanship. It's about rigor. And rigor is tested under pressure, not performed for applause. The irony hung thick. Marcus had been tested under pressure more than any of them could imagine. And the board proved it. A boy in the back muttered under his breath. Then let him finish. The words weren't loud, but they were enough. Heads turned. Whispers multiplied. A subtle rebellion was building. Quiet but undeniable. Marcus felt it too. For the first time he wasn't standing alone at the board. Something was shifting in the room. Small, fragile, but real. And as he stood there, chalk dust on his fingers, defiance in his silence, he caught the faintest glimpse of Jordan's phone in the middle row, its lens pointed straight at him. One student secretly recorded Marcus at the board. The faint glow of phones tucked low against desks had gone unnoticed by most. But not by Marcus. When his eyes caught the flicker of a screen in the middle row, he knew. Students were recording. At first his stomach tightened. Fear of exposure, of being misrepresented, of becoming a spectacle. But then the thought shifted. They weren't recording his failure. They were recording his refusal to bend, his defiance against humiliation. The truth of the moment wasn't going to vanish when the lecture ended. It was going to live outside these walls. Halverson, still posturing in front of the class, had no idea that his performance was being documented. He paced, gesturing toward the board like a judge at trial. Ellison has mistaken confidence for clarity. This, he pointed sharply at the chalk marks, is not physics. This is theater. But theater had an audience, and the audience wasn't buying the script anymore. Students leaned forward, whispering, their doubt shifting from Marcus to the professor himself. Jordan Hayes kept recording steadily, his camera angled just right to capture not just Marcus's work, but Halverson's words, his interruptions, his condescension. It wasn't just the math that mattered, it was the imbalance of power now frozen in pixels. When the lecture ended, Marcus didn't move at first. He let the students file out, some glancing at him, others looking away uncomfortably. He gathered his notebook slowly, his body heavy with both exhaustion and adrenaline. His solution, still half complete, remained on the board behind him, a silent testimony that no erasure could undo. Halverson erased it quickly, chalk dust flying, as though wiping away the lines could rewrite what had just happened. But the recordings left the room with the students, and by midnight they left the campus too. The first video hit a group chat between engineering majors, then leapt to social media. Caption: Professor tries to humiliate black student. Watch what happens. Within an hour it was on 3 different platforms, each clip cutting slightly differently, but telling the same story. Marcus standing at the board, steady hand drawing line after line, the murmurs of disbelief, the professor's interruptions, the refusal to erase. The comment sections lit up instantly. Wow. Genius under pressure. Why's the professor trying so hard to break him? He's right. I checked the math. This is why representation matters. By morning, the clips had gone viral. Tens of thousands of views turned to hundreds of thousands. Hashtag sprouted. Viral equation. Silent genius. Let him finish. Marcus's phone buzzed endlessly on his nightstand. At first he ignored it. He had fallen asleep late, his mind replaying the humiliation, the professor's sharp smile, the whispers. Even in dreams, the chalk squeaked against the board. But when he finally stirred awake and checked his phone, his breath caught. Message after message, notifications stacked higher than he'd ever seen. Friends, acquaintances, even people he hadn't spoken to in years. Marcus, is this you? Bro, you're all over Twitter. Check TikTok right now. He clicked the first link hesitantly. There he was, frozen on the screen, chalk in hand, the professor looming. The caption read, "They wanted him to fail. Instead, he made history." Marcus stared, his chest tightening. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted to be anyone's symbol. Yet here it was, his face, his silence, his brilliance, looped over and over across timelines he'd never touched. The comments poured in. Protect this young man. That professor should be ashamed. I felt this in my soul. Years of being doubted, and still shining. Where's the university statement? Marcus scrolled faster, his heart racing. His classmates had tagged him in threads. Some defended him passionately. Others whispered rumors. Was it staged? Did he cheat? But the majority spoke one truth. They had watched a young black student dismantle not just an equation, but a system of low expectations. At the same time, another name began trending. Professor Richard Halverson. The clips captured his interruptions, his dismissal, his sharp demand for Marcus to erase his work. Internet users froze the frames, dissected his tone, his smirk, his choice of words. Look at how he talks down to him. Why cut him off when he was right there? This is textbook academic racism. Halverson's reputation, once pristine in academic circles, was now entangled with controversy. His email inbox filled overnight, some with support from old colleagues, others with sharp accusations. His face, stern at the front of the class, was shared side by side with Marcus's. The contrast too powerful to ignore. Authority versus defiance. Silence versus brilliance. Meanwhile, Marcus's inbox filled with interview requests. Local reporters, student journalists, even a podcast host. They wanted to hear his story, to make him a voice for something bigger. But Marcus wasn't sure what he wanted. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't finished the equation. He hadn't gotten to prove himself fully. The world was celebrating a half-told story, and he was caught in the middle of it. His roommate, Devon, knocked on the door, phone in hand. "Dude," he said breathlessly, "you're trending worldwide. Worldwide. You're on the news." Marcus blinked, sitting up slowly. "What?" Devon shoved the phone at him. A news anchor's voice played. "This video of a black physics student at Preston University has sparked national debate." Marcus set the phone down, his head spinning. The room felt too small, the air too heavy. He had spent his life invisible, overlooked in classrooms, erased before he could even speak. And now, suddenly, he was everywhere. But fame wasn't freedom. It came with scrutiny. By morning, Marcus's name was everywhere, on the lips of supporters, critics, reporters, strangers. But so was Halverson's. By morning, Marcus's name was everywhere. But so was the professor's. The morning headlines stung sharper than chalk dust. Professor Richard Halverson scrolled through his phone with stiff fingers, each swipe revealing another article, another thread, another condemnation. His name trended beneath Marcus Ellison's, but not as a mentor, not as a celebrated academic. He was cast as the antagonist, the professor who tried to crush a student's brilliance. Every screenshot of his smirk, every clip of his interruptions, every demand to erase it burned his reputation like acid. For years, Halverson had basked in prestige. He was the one faculty cited in glowing profiles, the one parents boasted about when their children landed in his class. Now, overnight, the internet reframed him. Not as a genius, not as a guide, but as a gatekeeper of bias. He tossed the phone onto his desk, jaw tight, chest heaving. Ridiculous, he muttered to himself. Children with phones. They don't understand context. Yet beneath his indignation lurked something sharper. Fear. Fear that his authority had been dented. Fear that the institution he had mastered might begin to question him. Fear that Marcus Ellison's quiet defiance had exposed more than a single classroom moment. It had exposed him. Halverson straightened his tie in the mirror of his office, rehearsing lines. He would frame the event as misinterpretation, insist the video clips were selective, incomplete. His words needed to sound polished, professional, irrefutable. He had not humiliated Marcus. He would argue. He had been teaching rigor, testing comprehension, ensuring standards. That was his shield. The language of academia. Racism cloaked in pedagogy. By the time the physics department gathered that afternoon, Halverson wore his mask well. Faculty clustered around the long mahogany table, whispers bouncing across the room. The viral video had reached them too. Some looked uneasy, others curious. A few avoided his gaze entirely. Halverson cleared his throat, standing tall at the head of the table. "Colleagues," he began, voice calm, deliberate. "I trust you've seen the unfortunate footage circulating online." A murmur rippled. Heads nodded reluctantly. He spread his hands as if steadying the room. "Let me be clear, what you saw was not what it seemed. My intent was never to embarrass a student. It was to test his understanding under pressure, an essential part of developing scientific rigor. The clips are taken out of context. They show fragments, not the full scope of instruction." Professor Gaines, a quiet man in his 60s, adjusted his glasses. "Richard, the boy's work was correct. Why stop him?" Halverson smiled faintly, the kind of smile honed over decades of intellectual combat. "Correct looking, yes. But precision in physics is not about appearances. Anyone can mimic a pattern. What matters is comprehension. I suspected he had memorized material he didn't fully grasp. My role is to protect the integrity of our program. If I pressed him, it was out of duty." The words were smooth, reasonable, cloaked in the language of responsibility. Heads around the table bobbed, some relieved to accept his narrative. It was easier than confronting the alternative. That they had all overlooked Marcus. That their system had allowed this humiliation to happen. But not everyone nodded. Dr. Evelyn Carter, the youngest professor in the department, sat stiffly at the far end of the table. Her eyes were sharp, her voice quiet but steady. "With respect, Richard, the video doesn't show a student out of his depth. It shows a student working through advanced material, with remarkable clarity. It shows him being stopped." The room stilled. All eyes turned. Halverson's smile didn't falter, but his voice cooled. "Evelyn, you're new here. Perhaps you don't understand how quickly things can spiral online. Students love to frame themselves as victims. It garners sympathy." Her jaw tightened. "Or maybe," she said, "it reveals something we don't want to admit." The silence that followed was heavy. No one spoke. No one defended Marcus. No one challenged Halverson further. The meeting moved on, but the fracture was there. When it ended, Halverson returned to his office, his mask slipping as the door clicked shut. He sank into his chair, the polished rhetoric collapsing into raw envy. Marcus's name overshadowed his own, in every headline, every thread, Every conversation. A 19-year-old had stolen the spotlight he had built over a lifetime. Halverson's envy curdled into something darker. Marcus wasn't being celebrated for physics alone. He was being celebrated for defying him. The narrative wasn't about the math anymore. It was about race, power, injustice. And in that narrative, Halverson was the villain. He refused to accept it, so he recalibrated. If Marcus's brilliance couldn't be denied outright, it could be reframed. It could be diminished. He drafted an email to select colleagues, careful in tone. While the student displayed an interesting grasp of technique, I remain unconvinced of his originality. I fear he may have drawn upon advanced material he should not have had access to. We must investigate before celebrating prematurely. The words dripped with suspicion cloaked in concern, bias hidden beneath the guise of protecting academic standards. It was institutional racism at its most polished. No slurs, no outbursts, only the quiet shifting of credibility away from the student who had earned it. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his dorm, watching the storm swirl online. His face appeared on news broadcasts, in think pieces, in memes that paired his calm defiance with captions like "Genius under fire." But for every post praising him, there were others seeded with doubt. Anonymous accounts asked, "How could a freshman solve this? Cheating? Staged?" The doubt dug deep. Marcus scrolled until his eyes blurred, each word like a pebble in his chest. He had lived with suspicion all his life, but now it was magnified 1,000-fold. Strangers across the country dissecting his worth. Devin, his roommate, tried to pull the phone from his hands. "Man, stop reading that trash. You saw the other side. People are inspired by you." Marcus shook his head. "But look at this. They're saying I couldn't have done it, that I must have cheated." "It's the same thing, Devin. Just louder." Devin sat heavily on the bed. "So what? You know the truth. People always talk. Doesn't change what you did." Marcus closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He wanted to believe it. But the weight of envy, sharpened by Halverson's words behind closed doors, was already shaping what came next. Late that evening, as Marcus tried to focus on his notebook, his laptop pinged with a new email. His stomach dropped when he saw the sender. Office of the Dean. Subject, meeting request. Academic inquiry. Marcus received an unexpected email, calling him to the dean's office. The email from the dean's office glowed cold on Marcus's laptop screen. Meeting request. Academic inquiry. The words were formal, precise, and heavy with implication. His chest tightened as he read it again and again, hoping the meaning might change. But it never did. This wasn't a congratulations. It wasn't an invitation to celebrate what he had done. It was an inquiry, a question, a suspicion. Devin leaned over his shoulder, frowning. "Man, that doesn't sound good. But maybe it's nothing. Maybe they just want to, I don't know, clear the air." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Clear the air doesn't sound like this." He tapped the screen. Academic inquiry. They don't want answers. They want explanations. Slee evaded him. That night, every time he closed his eyes, the word repeated, inquiry. It wasn't about truth. It was about investigation. By morning, his body was heavy, his hands cold. He dressed carefully, pulling on his cleanest shirt, straightening the collar twice. He wanted to look composed, even as dread weighed him down. The dean's office was on the top floor of the administration building, a place Marcus had never been invited before. The halls were silent, the carpet thick, muffling his steps. A secretary led him through polished wooden doors, into a room that smelled faintly of leather and dust. Dean Whitaker sat behind a mahogany desk, his posture rigid, his eyes unreadable. His suit was immaculate, his hands folded neatly on the desk as though he had been waiting for this moment all morning. He didn't smile. "Mr. Ellison," Whitaker said, his voice even but cool. "Have a seat." Marcus sat, the chair too soft beneath him, the silence stretching. He tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of the room pressed harder with every second. "I assume you're aware of why you've been asked here," the dean began. Marcus shook his head. "Not exactly, sir." Whitaker leaned back, studying him carefully. "The events in Professor Halverson's class have drawn considerable attention. More attention than this university typically invites." Marcus swallowed. "I didn't ask for the attention." The dean nodded slowly. "Perhaps not, but attention invites questions, and in this case, serious questions. You understand that, don't you?" Marcus hesitated. "Questions about what?" Whitaker's gaze sharpened. About how a freshman, someone who has not completed even the fundamentals of upper-level coursework, was able to engage with an equation most graduate students cannot touch. The words stung, more than Marcus expected. He had lived his life under the shadow of doubt, but hearing it spoken so plainly, in such a formal voice, twisted deep. "I solved it because I could," Marcus said softly. The dean raised a brow. "Because you could?" Marcus nodded, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Yes, sir. I studied. I worked. I've been doing problems like this for years. Just because I'm a freshman doesn't mean Just because you're a freshman doesn't mean you should be doubted." The dean's tone was calm, but the undercurrent was sharp. "That's what you want me to believe?" Marcus's chest tightened. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to say more. But he knew that here, in this office, his words were already being measured against a scale tilted against him. Whitaker leaned forward slightly, folding his hands tighter. "Mr. Ellison, brilliance is rare, unlikely. And when it appears where we least expect it, it invites scrutiny. You must understand that." The phrase "where we least expect it" hung in the air like smoke. Marcus heard the subtext clearly. Someone like you. He clenched his hands on his lap, his knuckles white. "So what are you saying?" "I am saying," the dean replied, voice even, "that questions have been raised. Professor Halverson has expressed concern that your performance may not have been authentic." Marcus froze. "Authentic?" Whitaker nodded. "He suggested that perhaps you had prior access to the problem, that you may have memorized material from advanced coursework, or even received outside assistance." The words hit like a blow. Marcus leaned back slightly, breath sharp. "That's not true. I'd never seen it before that class. I solved it on my own." "Then prove it," the dean said simply. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus stared at him, the weight of the demand crushing. Prove it. His word wasn't enough. His work wasn't enough. His brilliance wasn't enough. He was guilty until proven otherwise. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, his voice trembling but firm, "you saw the videos. You saw me solve it in real time. Isn't that proof?" Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "Videos can be misleading. They capture performance, not comprehension." Marcus felt the sting again. The professor's words replayed in his mind, the accusation of theater, mimicry, imitation, and now the dean was repeating them, dressed in official language, framed as academic integrity. "You want the truth?" Marcus asked quietly. His voice shook, but there was steel beneath it. "The truth is, I understood that equation. The second I saw it. I solved it because that's what I do. Because I love it. Not because I cheated. Not because I memorize. Because it's what my mind knows how to do." The dean didn't respond right away. He leaned back, his face unreadable, his silence heavier than any argument. He let it stretch, let Marcus sweat under its weight. It wasn't just doubt, it was strategy. Silence as pressure. Finally Whitaker spoke. "Passion is admirable, Mr. Ellison. But passion does not rule out misconduct. Until we determine otherwise, I must treat this matter with the seriousness it deserves." Marcus' heart pounded. "You're accusing me of something I didn't do." The dean's eyes remained steady. "I am not accusing. I am investigating. There is a difference." But the difference felt hollow. It was accusation wrapped in formality, bias cloaked in policy. Marcus sat there, his body rigid, his throat tight. He realized then what this was. This wasn't about the math. It wasn't about rigor. It was about who was allowed to be brilliant, and who was not. Whitaker slid a folder across the desk. "You will be required to attend a formal hearing before the academic board. Until then you are under review. Do you understand?" Marcus stared at the folder, his chest aching. A hearing. A trial. Essentially for daring to be himself in front of a board that had already decided what people like him were capable of. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir." The dean nodded curtly, leaning back in his chair. "Good. You may go." Marcus rose slowly, his legs heavy, his head spinning. He walked out of the office, the thick carpet swallowing his footsteps, the polished doors closing behind him with a soft thud. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, the world spinning around him, the truth pressing hard. They didn't want to believe him. They never had. And now, they were calling it official. Marcus was accused of cheating. Marcus walked out of the dean's office with the folder clutched in his hand, but it felt heavier than paper. The hallway stretched long and silent, every polished surface reflecting his figure back at him like an accusation. Students passed by on their way to class, laughing, chattering, their voices echoing in contrast to the silence swallowing him whole. For them it was just another day. For him it was the beginning of a trial he hadn't chosen. By the time he reached his dorm, Devon was waiting, pacing. "What happened?" he asked quickly. Marcus dropped the folder on the desk. "They think I cheated," he said flatly. The words tasted bitter. "They're calling a hearing." Devon's eyes widened. "What?" "That's insane. Everyone saw you do it." Marcus shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Proof doesn't matter. They've already decided people like me can't do what I did. So they're making it official." Devon sat heavily on the bed, running a hand through his hair.
Man, this is messed up.
Messed up didn't begin to cover it. Over the next few days, Marcus felt the weight of suspicion everywhere. Friends who had once shared notes with him avoided his eyes in class. The hallway conversations that had once included him now ended when he approached. Even professors who had quietly praised his work before now looked away when they passed him, their silence louder than words. The worst part wasn't the open doubt. It was the quiet. The way people stopped talking when he entered the room. The way whispers rose after he left. The way his name, once shouted online with admiration, was now paired with words like integrity, hearing, and possible misconduct. Marcus sat through lectures with his notebook open, but his hand barely moved. He couldn't focus. His equations blurred together, his passion dulled by the constant weight pressing down on him. Every glance felt like a judgment, every silence like a verdict. One afternoon, as he walked across campus, he overheard two students behind him. "Did you see the update?" One whispered. "Yeah. They're saying he probably had the problem beforehand. No way he could have done that cold." "Exactly. Makes sense now." Marcus's steps slowed. He wanted to turn, to confront them, to shout the truth. But he didn't. His silence wasn't protection anymore. It was suffocation. That night, alone in his dorm, he stared at his notebook, filled with half-finished equations. His pencil hovered above the page, but refused to move. For the first time in years, the numbers didn't feel like escape. They felt like prison bars. Devon tried to encourage him. "Bro, you gotta fight this. You can't just let them bury you." Marcus shook his head. "Fight what? They don't want me to prove anything. They just want me gone." His voice cracked, heavy with exhaustion. "I thought maybe this would be different. I thought if I just kept my head down, worked harder, let the math speak for me, it would be enough. But it's never enough." Devon's eyes softened. "Marcus, you're not the problem. The system is." But Marcus barely heard him. His mind was already slipping into darker places. He imagined walking away, dropping out, leaving Preston behind, disappearing before the hearing could drag him further. Maybe invisibility had been better than this. The campus that once felt like possibility, now felt like exile. The whispers never stopped. Even online, where videos of his brilliance still circulated, the narrative had shifted. Genius or fraud, one headline read. Another clip, edited selectively, painted him as evasive in the classroom. Halverson as the stern authority correcting him. The truth was being bent, reshaped, erased. The night before the weekend, Marcus sat by the window of his dorm, staring out at the campus lights. His notebook lay closed beside him. He felt hollow, emptied out by suspicion, ready to let go of the fight he hadn't chosen. But then an unexpected knock at the door. Devon looked up from his desk. "You expecting anyone?" Marcus shook his head. He stood slowly, hesitating before opening the door. Standing there was Dr. Evelyn Carter, the young assistant professor who had spoken up quietly in the department meeting, though Marcus hadn't known it. She held a folder against her chest, her expression calm but her eyes sharp with conviction. "Marcus Ellison?" she asked softly. Marcus blinked, stunned. "Yes." She stepped inside, glancing briefly at Devon before focusing on Marcus. "I know what they're doing to you," she said. Her voice was steady, her words precise, "and I'm not going to let them do it alone." Marcus's chest tightened, his breath catching. For the first time in weeks, he felt something crack through the suffocating silence. Just when Marcus considered leaving it all behind, an unexpected ally appeared. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, staring at Dr. Evelyn Carter as though she were a mirage. The campus had left him alone under suspicion. Every hallway colder than the last. Every silence heavier. And now here she was, young, sharp-eyed, her presence carrying both calm and defiance.
Devon glanced between them, wary. You're a professor? Evelyn nodded. Assistant professor. The lowest rung on the ladder, she said with a faint, wry smile. Her gaze returned to Marcus. But I've been watching. Not just the video, not just the noise online. I've seen you in class. I've seen the way your work gets dismissed before it's read. And I saw what happened in that lecture hall. Marcus swallowed, unsure of what to say. Words tangled in his throat. You believe me? Ellen stepped inside fully, lowering her folder onto the desk. Believe you, Marcus? I know what I saw. You weren't faking. You weren't mimicking. You were thinking, and that terrified them. The words hit deep. No one had said it so plainly before. Not Devon, not his classmates, not even Marcus himself. He had always carried the suspicion that brilliance, when it came from him, was unwelcome. Evelyn had named it out loud. Devon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Finally, someone around here with eyes. Marcus sat slowly on the edge of his bed, staring at the closed folder she had brought. Why are you here? You could get in trouble for this. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Because trouble is already circling you. And if you stand alone, they'll bury you. They'll frame your silence as guilt. They'll turn your brilliance into misconduct. And I can't watch that happen. She opened the folder, spreading its contents across the desk. Notes, highlighted passages from the university's academic policies, a printed transcript of the video comments. Marcus leaned forward, eyes scanning the pile. What is this? Leverage, she said simply. Documentation. Their rules. Their contradictions. And public opinion. Devon whistled low. You came ready for war. Ellen shook her head. Not war. Defense. Marcus, the dean is framing this as an inquiry into academic integrity. But it's more than that. It's about precedent. If they let your success stand, it forces them to confront their own biases. If they tear you down, they reinforce the system. That's what this hearing will be. Marcus felt his stomach twist. And you're saying I'm the test case? She met his eyes steadily. Yes. And I'm saying you can win. The words should have felt like hope, but Marcus hesitated. Win. Even if I prove myself, they'll just say it was luck. Or a trick. Or worse, that I cheated smarter than they thought. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice low, sharp. Marcus, they don't want to believe you because believing you would shatter their narrative. But the truth is already out there. The video, the comments, the way students are whispering now. You don't need to create proof, you already are proof. Devon slapped his knee. Exactly. You showed them once. You can do it again. And this time, you won't be alone. Marcus looked between them, the weight of his isolation cracking just slightly. For the first time, the fight didn't feel impossible. Still, fear lingered. Why risk yourself? You said it, you're on the lowest rung. If you stand with me and then I lose, Evelyn said firmly. But if I stay silent, I lose something bigger. My integrity. She paused, eyes fierce. I know what it's like to be dismissed in rooms like these. To have your work second-guessed, your presence questioned. I've lived, and I won't let them do it to you without a fight. The room fell silent. Devon leaned back, nodding slowly. Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. He had been ready to walk away, ready to surrender to the system. Now someone was pulling him back, reminding him he wasn't invisible. Ellen slid a sheet of paper toward him. The hearing is in 3 days. Between now and then, we prepare. They'll test you. They'll try to corner you like Halverson did, but with sharper claws. You'll need to stay steady. Marcus picked up the paper. His name sat at the top in bold, beneath the heading, Academic Integrity Board. Notice of hearing. His chest tightened, but he nodded slowly. Devon leaned forward. So what's the plan? Elliman's lips curved into the faintest smile. The plan is simple. We turn their own system against them. They'll expect Marcus to defend himself emotionally, to break under pressure. Instead, he'll do what he's always done. Solve. Think. Show them brilliance they can't erase. And while he does, I'll remind them of every policy that demands fairness, every precedent that demands equity. They built this system. We'll make them live by it. Marcus stared at her, disbelief flickering into cautious hope. You really think it'll work? Evelyn's eyes softened. I think you've already proven it can. For the first time in days, Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not the crushing weight of suspicion, but a flicker of resolve. He wasn't alone anymore, and that changed everything. As Evelyn gathered the papers back into her folder, Marcus leaned back on the bed, exhaling slowly. He wasn't free yet. The hearing loomed like a storm cloud, dark and threatening. But he was no longer standing in the rain without cover. Devon broke the silence with a grin. Well then, let's get you ready to blow their minds. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her voice steady. Not just their minds, their excuse. The weight in the room thickened again. But this time it wasn't despair. It was determination. Together they prepared for a department hearing that could decide Marcus's future. The hearing chamber was nothing like a classroom. It wasn't built for learning. It was built for judgment. Long oak tables framed the space, polished to a sterile shine. At the far end sat 5 board members. Older, rigid, their suits pressed, their expressions severe. Behind them, tall windows cast pale light across the room, but it felt more like interrogation lamps than sunlight. Marcus sat at the opposite end, with Evelyn at his side. Devon had wanted to come, but students weren't allowed in. Evelyn had argued relentlessly for Marcus's right to representation, and though the board had relented, their glares made it clear they hadn't wanted her there. She adjusted her papers, her face calm but her shoulders tense, the way someone looks before walking into fire. Dean Whitaker sat in the center of the board, flanked by 2 professors Marcus had never taken a class with, and 2 administrators whose titles he couldn't recall. Halverson sat slightly to the side, not officially on the panel but close enough to be present, his face carved into stone. The dean spoke first. Mr. Ellison, this proceeding is not a trial, though it may feel like one. It is a review of your conduct and capability. We are here to determine whether your performance in Professor Halverson's lecture was the result of legitimate skill or misconduct. The words echoed heavy in Marcus's chest. Not if you are brilliant, but if you cheated. The premise itself was already tilted against him. Ellen leaned close, whispering, "Steady. Remember, they'll try to corner you. Answer with precision." Marcus nodded faintly, gripping the table to keep his hands from trembling. The first professor, a balding man with glasses, leaned forward. "Mr. Ellison, can you explain how you approached the initial reduction on the equation presented in class?" Marcus inhaled slowly, steadying himself. "I recognized the symmetry of the boundary condition. It mirrored reductions I've studied in advanced texts, so I applied the simplification directly." The professor arched a brow. "Advanced texts? You're a freshman. How did you have access to material beyond your level?" Marcus' jaw tightened. "The library. Public shelves. I read ahead." A murmur rippled down the table. One administrator leaned back, unimpressed. Another scribbled notes quickly, as though Marcus's curiosity itself were suspicious. The second professor, a woman with clipped speech, asked, "Did anyone help you study this material? A tutor, perhaps?" "Another professor?" "No," Marcus said firmly. "I worked through the problems alone." Halverson spoke then, his voice cool. "And yet your performance mimicked techniques specific to graduate-level seminars. Forgive my skepticism, but it seems unlikely you achieved this independently." Evelyn's head snapped toward him. "Unlikely doesn't mean impossible," she said sharply. "And skepticism is not proof." The dean raised a hand. "Dr. Carter, please remember you are here as support, not counsel. Let the student answer." Marcus' chest burned, but he pushed the anger down. He looked directly at Halverson. "I didn't mimic. I solved. There's a difference." For the first time, Halverson's eyes flickered, a faint crack in his composure. The board continued. More questions. They grilled him on terminology, on derivations, on why he chose one step over another. Each question dripped with disbelief, every word implying that he couldn't possibly belong at this table of minds. Marcus answered steadily, his voice low but clear, walking them through reasoning that flowed like a river. Whispers rose among the panel. Some leaned forward now, their pens slowing. His explanations weren't defensive, they were insightful. He wasn't just repeating knowledge, he was teaching it. One administrator frowned, tapping her pen. "Mr. Ellison, where did you learn to think this way?" Marcus hesitated, then answered honestly. "Late nights, books, equations, curiosity. I didn't learn because someone told me to. I learned because it was the only place I felt free." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but he steadied it. Physics makes sense when the world doesn't. The room stilled. For a flicker of a moment, the board members looked at him not as a defendant, but as something else, a young man telling a truth they hadn't expected. But the dean cut the silence quickly. "Thank you, Mr. Ellison. Now, if you would, we'd like you to demonstrate." Marcus blinked. "Demonstrate." Whitaker gestured to a chalkboard that had been rolled into the room. "We've prepared a few problems. Solve them for us. In real time. No notes. No assistance." The demand was clear. They didn't trust his words. They wanted a performance. Evelyn whispered, "This is their trap. They'll try to push you until you break." Marcus stood slowly, his legs heavy, his hands cold. He picked up the chalk, staring at the first equation already scrawled on the board. It was advanced, yes, but not impossible. He exhaled, steadying himself, and began. The chalk scratched softly. Line after line appeared. The logic flowed, clean and precise. Murmurs rose behind him. By the time he stepped back, the solution was not only correct but elegant. The second problem followed. Harder. A trick embedded in the structure. Marcus paused longer this time, sweat prickling at his temple. But then his eyes lit faintly. He saw the trap, the hidden symmetry. His hand moved again, unraveling the deception, solving what had been meant to expose him. The third professor leaned back, arms crossed. "He's right," he admitted reluctantly. Halverson's jaw tightened. "Luck," he muttered. But it wasn't luck. The board could see it now. Marcus wasn't fumbling. He was weaving logic with clarity that startled even those trained for decades. Then the dean stood. He approached the board, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. He wrote a problem himself, his strokes deliberate, the symbols sprawling across the surface. Marcus's eyes widened. This wasn't a test from a textbook. This was something else, dense, twisted, nearly unreadable. The dean turned back, dusting chalk from his fingers. "This," he said, "is unsolved by many. I doubt you'll manage it, but let's see your attempt." Ellen stiffened. "That's beyond any curriculum. It isn't fair." Whitaker cut her off. "Life isn't fair, Dr. Carter. Let's test his truth." The room held its breath. Marcus stepped closer, staring at the dense sprawl. His chest tightened. This wasn't a test anymore. This was a gauntlet. And the worst part? He realized he had seen it before. Not in books, not in class, but scribbled in the margins of his father's old notebook. Years ago, a fragment he hadn't understood then, but remembered now. The final problem handed to him was one even the dean could not solve. The boardroom had shifted into something colder than a classroom, more suffocating than any exam. The chalkboard loomed in front of Marcus. The equation sprawled across it like a labyrinth designed to trap him. Every symbol felt deliberate, not for clarity but for intimidation. This wasn't a problem from a book. It was the dean's personal creation, built to overwhelm, to silence, to end the debate before it could begin. Marcus stood there, chalk in hand, staring. His palms sweated, his pulse raced. He could feel the weight of every eye, Evelyn steady and sharp with encouragement, Halverson's gleaming with hunger for his collapse, the boards heavy with detached expectation. And then memory struck. That notebook, his father's old, battered notebook with edges frayed and pages filled with equations. Marcus had once traced with a child's finger. He had never understood them fully then, but their shapes had stayed with him, branded deep into his memory. One of them, yes, this very structure, fragmented but familiar, had been there. The realization steadied him. He breathed, slow and deliberate, and began. The chalk whispered across the board. At first, the strokes were tentative, cautious, his mind testing pathways. The board leaned forward slightly, pens ready to note mistakes. But then Marcus's hand steadied. The logic unfolded in his mind, with sudden clarity. The pieces slotting together not as intimidation but as rhythm. Line after line appeared, the dense sprawl unraveling into elegant patterns. Marcus's voice, soft but sure, accompanied his work. "This reduction shifts the symmetry here. You've written it like a wall, but it's not. It bends. Watch." He marked a line, circled a symbol, carried it forward. The room leaned in, unconsciously, scholars who had doubted him now following like students to a teacher. Elowen's eyes glistened, pride sharpening her features. Halverson's smirk faltered, his jaw tightening as the board filled with proof. Marcus pressed on. The chalk snapped once, breaking in half, but he caught the piece before it fell. His hand trembled briefly, then steadied again. He spoke as he wrote, his tone calm, almost gentle. "It's not about memorization. It's about seeing the path others overlook. The words weren't just about the equation, they were about his life, about being overlooked, dismissed, silenced, until the truth could no longer be ignored. By the time he neared the end, the room was silent. No scribbling pens, no whispered doubts, just the soft scratch of chalk, transforming complexity into clarity. Finally, he stepped back, dropping the chalk onto the ledge. His chest rose and fell, sweat dampening his collar. On the board behind him, the equation gleamed, not incomplete, not uncertain but whole. Saw. The silence afterward was heavier than applause. It was the silence of undeniable truth, the kind that made denial impossible but admission unbearable. One board member, the balding professor with glasses, cleared his throat softly. That. He stopped, shaking his head. That was correct. Perfectly correct. Another leaned forward, scanning the solution. Her lips parted slightly. Not just correct. Elegant. I didn't see it until... She stopped herself, glancing nervously at the dean. Halverson shifted in his seat, his fists clenched tight against his thighs. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. For the first time, his voice, so sharp, so commanding, failed him. Ellen smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving Marcus. Told you, she whispered, though only he could hear. Marcus stood tall, his gaze steady, but inside his chest a storm raged. Relief battled with exhaustion, pride with anger. He had done it. He had proven himself again. But at what cost? His brilliance had not been celebrated until it was forced, dragged out under suspicion. Even in victory, it felt stolen from him. The dean, silent until now, finally picked up his pen. He scribbled something slowly on the paper in front of him. His face revealed nothing, his posture unchanged. When he finished, he placed the pen down carefully, deliberately, and looked up. His eyes were unreadable. The dean put down his pen, eyes unreadable. The dean's silence stretched so long that it seemed the air itself might crack. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, swept across the board, then back to Marcus. No expression, no hint of approval or condemnation, just the slow, deliberate stillness of a man caught between truth and power. The other board members whispered faintly, pens scratching, their language stiff with formality but laced with awe. The solution was flawless. The symmetry undeniable. Marcus had done what even the dean had failed to do. He had cracked the problem in front of them all, with the calm clarity of someone who did not need permission to be brilliant. Halverson sat rigid, his knuckles white against the table, his jaw clenched, his face a mask, but his eyes betrayed him. They flicked toward Marcus, then quickly away, unable to meet the truth he had tried so hard to bury. The student he had chosen as spectacle had become mirror, reflecting every fracture in the system. Halverson had upheld. Finally, Dean Whitaker spoke. His voice was low, even carefully measured. Mr. Ellison, your work is correct. The words landed with a weight that filled the room. Evelyn Carter exhaled softly, her hand brushing the edge of the table, steadying herself. Marcus didn't move. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He only nodded faintly, his expression steady, though inside his chest thundered. Whitaker continued. This hearing concludes with no evidence of misconduct. You are cleared of charges. He paused, his tone sharpening. But brilliance, Mr. Ellison, comes with responsibility. I expect you to remember that. The warning hung heavy in the air, cloaked as advice but ringing as a leash. Evelyn's eyes narrowed at the phrasing, but she stayed silent. Marcus caught it too. Even in acknowledgement, they couldn't grant him freedom without restraint. The gavel-like sound of a folder snapping closed signaled the end. The board rose, chairs scraping softly against the polished floor. Some left quickly, others lingered with cautious glances. Halverson stood last, his face stiff, his pride cracked but not shattered. He left without a word. Evelyn turned to Marcus, her voice low, fierce. They tried everything, and you still stood. Don't let them make you think this isn't victory. Marcus nodded slowly, his throat tight. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like survival. She held his gaze. Survival is victory, when the world wants you erased. But remember, survival can become legacy. The words echoed inside him, as they walked out of the chamber into the bright hallway. Outside the building, the air was alive with noise. A crowd had gathered, students, reporters, cameras flashing. The viral storm had only grown, and now it collided with reality. Microphones thrust forward, voices overlapping. Marcus, how do you feel? Do you think the board was fair? What do you say to the people who doubted you? Marcus blinked under the sudden blaze of attention. He had walked into the hearing invisible, but now he stood at the center of a storm larger than anything he could have imagined. Ellen leaned close. You don't have to answer everything. Just speak your truth. He steadied himself, the noise buzzing around him like static. His truth was simple. The board had doubted him, the professor had tried to humiliate him, and still, he had solved. Not for applause, not for proof, but because brilliance was his language, whether or not the world wanted to hear it. I didn't cheat, he said clearly, his voice carrying over the crowd. I didn't fake anything. I just solved what was in front of me. That's all I've ever done. But maybe now you'll understand what it means to work twice as hard, just to be seen once. The crowd fell quiet, the words heavier than sound bites. Reporters scribbled, cameras whirred. A ripple of recognition passed through the students, some nodding faintly, others looking away, unsettled by the weight of what he had said. The questions kept coming, louder now, sharper. Marcus answered a few, but he didn't perform. He didn't smile for cameras. He simply stood, steady, his presence itself a declaration. Later that evening, the news spread fast. Headlines called him the silent genius, the student who defied the system, the viral equation made flesh. Clips from the hearing circulated, showing him dismantling problem after problem, while professors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time, the narrative wasn't about doubt. It was about brilliance undeniable. But Marcus didn't scroll. He sat in his dorm room with Evelyn and Devon, the three of them in quiet reflection. Devon broke the silence first. Man, you know what you just did? You didn't just beat them, you exposed them. You showed the whole world what they tried to do to you. Evelyn nodded. And that's bigger than one equation. That's legacy. Marcus leaned back, staring at the ceiling, exhaustion settling into his bones. Legacy. The word echoed. He hadn't asked for it. He hadn't wanted it. But maybe that was what resistance looked like. Not a choice but a responsibility. The campus buzzed for days. Some professors avoided him entirely. Others offered quiet congratulations, whispered as though afraid of being overheard. Students stopped him in hallways, some with admiration, some with envy. He was no longer invisible, but visibility came with weight. And then the twist. Reporters began digging, not just into Marcus, but into Halverson. Old evaluations surfaced, complaints long buried, stories of students who had been dismissed, who had dropped out under his scrutiny. A pattern began to form, and the internet seized it. Halverson's name, once synonymous with prestige, now swirled in controversy. Ellen showed Marcus the article one evening. You didn't just defend yourself. You opened the door for others. Marcus stared at the headline, Professor under review after viral incident exposes pattern of bias. He felt no triumph, only a deep, steady relief. Maybe now, the silence that had swallowed so many would finally break. The story had started with humiliation. It had ended with exposure, and yet the cameras weren't done. Days later, as Marcus stepped out of class, reporters swarmed again. Microphones rose, questions flew. One voice cut through, sharp and direct. What would you say to the professor now? As cameras rolled outside, a reporter asked him, what would you say to the professor now? Stories like Marcus's aren't rare. They're just rarely seen. Every day, brilliance is dismissed, voices are silenced, and potential is erased. If his fight moved you, type yes, if you believe in justice, and subscribe so these stories are never buried again.